Closed back headphones are finally getting some good competition. Let's talk about it. This is the FiiO FT-1, not to be confused with the JT-1, a headphone that I reviewed a while back, not so favorably. This is a closed back dynamic driver headphone with a rather unique driver under the hood. It pretty closely resembles a biocellulose dynamic driver, and it's a pretty dang large sized for a closed back as well. We've got acoustic mesh around the baffle here, wood closed backs, pads that are reasonably sized but not very deep. Luckily on the inside of the cup this does recess inwards a little bit, so the pads, while not being very deep, my ear doesn't actually contact the driver, which was a concern I first had when I was looking at these. They have dual 3.5mm entry on the bottom and a decent cable that comes with them. It also has this little strap here so that you can travel with it a little bit more easily. Metal terminations on both ends. Pretty nice. It is better than the cables that come with basically anything Headphone makes. And on the subject of that, it's also a better closed back than anything Headphone makes. Oh, we'll get to that in the sound though. The mechanism for tilt on the side is spring loaded, so these will reset back to their default position, which is nice, though it's not enough of a spring to make it uncomfortable on the head. They swivel and tilt a little bit, but not a ton. More than plenty for my head shape. It does feel a little bit cheap, but at least it's light. The adjustment mechanism on the side is actually pretty nice feeling. There's padding all the way around on top, though for me it wasn't quite enough, and this ended up presenting a hot spot on top of my head, which is why I'm using this. I'm sure you notice the suspension strap on here. That doesn't come on the headphone. This is a soft 3D printed suspension strap from Capra Audio. I will link them at the video description, but he makes one that fits the FiiO FT-1, and it basically made all my complaints about the comfort of this headphone disappear. Now it is super comfortable and I can wear it all day. So if you're gonna get this thing, you should definitely get the capper strap for it. Let's talk about sound. Subjective first and then objective after that. This is direct competition for the AKG K361 and in many ways surpasses it, which is massive for me to say because I've been saying for years, I wish there was a headphone like the AKG K361 that was built better and a little more comfortable, because that would just dominate the closed back market. Things under $1,000 would struggle to compete with that. And here we have a headphone that does that. It in many ways surpasses the capabilities of the K361, and it's built better, and it's notably more comfortable. That's massive. That's genuinely massive. And at a headphone that is not $1,000, is not $700, is not $500. In fact, it matches the price of the K361 around the $130 to $150 mark, depending on where you find them and if they're on sale. Though I have seen some of these units also on eBay for like $170. That seems a little bit silly. I mean, it's still a great value, to be honest, at that price, but just get them for retail. Which, speaking of, I did buy this pair myself. This was not sent to me for review by anybody. So how do they sound? Really excellent. Not perfect, but really excellent. Bass is very deep, it's very well extended, it's punchy, it's a little bit warm in the low mid-range, but not enough to be boomy and bloated. So it's a clean and deep and extended sub bass. The mid-range is nice and full. There's no shout, there's no honk, no nothing like that. It's just a nice, full, well-rounded linear mid-range. It's got plenty of vocal presence. The middle of the ear gain sounds slightly lower than the rest of the frequency response. And above that, there is a couple of narrow spikes in the treble. I find that the audibility of these spikes really depends on how loud you're listening and what you're listening to. It's actually still notably less treble than on the K361, though we'll get to that in frequency response later. So for me, and at the volumes I listen to, I find this to be a very smooth sounding closed back headphone. It still extends very well into the upper regions of the treble to the extent that the vast majority of people will be able to hear, which is near 20 kilohertz. And because of this, it has a very nice airy quality to it while still being smooth. There are still tracks where I could take the treble and push it too far, but it would generally have to be tracks where it was intentional. There is one problem frequency in this headphone that I'll get to in the frequency response segment, But while we're still talking about subjective sound, I want to get into soundstage and imaging. Imaging is super solid. It's nowhere near as good as an open back like a PC38X, but for a closed back, it's very good imaging. The stage is what surprised me the most though. There are plenty of tracks that sounded intimate on this headphone, but there's also tracks that sounded very spacious. Gosh, I think the name of the album, I need to look it up on my computer over here. I think it's called Sacred Spaces. It is by the artist SYML, produced by Brian Eichelberger. Did I pronounce that right? Eichelberger? And Brian Fennell. It is an artist that is performing in a cathedral, and they recorded the space around them. Really, really cool. And that opened up on this in a way that I don't usually get on many other closed backs. I've got that same experience on the DCA-E3. I've gotten that experience on the K361, but not much else. At least not much else in the closed back world. I would also get that on the Atrium closed when I listened to that at Can Jam. So what this is doing in terms of soundstage is really, really impressive. It's not on every track, but on the tracks that really take advantage of larger spaces, this plays to it super well. The Billie Eilish track that released in 2020 titled My Future sounds really good on these also. Very spacious, very intimate at the same time with the vocals. It's just a really cool, well-rounded soundstage that can do intimacy and space both very, very well. Does it sound detailed? I think so. I think it entirely depends on the recording you're listening to. There are tracks that I get a bit of a grainy sound, and I think that has to do with a feature we'll talk about in frequency response. But at $150, I am insanely impressed. Like, this is going to basically live on my head at home. Well, when I need a closed back anyway. I think that for trade shows, when I'm going to be editing on the road, I'm still going to take either my CD900 ST or my MDR7506 with me. Those are just more durable feeling headphones for the road that are still nice and neutral. Whereas this, I would use less for editing and more for listening to music or playing video games. So let's pivot here. Let's talk about frequency response and measurements. I did my measurements of this headphone on the Brüel & Kjær 4128C head and torso simulator. First, just the headphone here. You can see it extends very, very well deep into the bass. We have a little bit of a bump in the realm of like 150 hertz, and it goes back down from there into a pretty linear mid-range from about 300 hertz up until about 2 kilohertz. We have pretty solid linearity. A little bit of a dip that ends about 3.6K at its lowest point, which I would rather take a dip right there than a peak like we have on the Focal Azuris. Still a good headphone, but the shifted ear gain on those is not quite to my personal taste. Then we have this. I think this is probably the only real fault in this headphone's frequency response is right here at 6 kilohertz. While this is still within the window of the average listener preference, it is more elevated compared to that like 3.5, 4 kilohertz range, and to the areas right after it at about 7 kilohertz. So 6 kilohertz does stand out a bit to me. And while not nearly as bright as a lot of headphones that have 6K peaks like your HG800s and things like that, it's still enough that there are songs where I notice it, and it adds a bit of a grainy texture to certain tracks. From there, we continue through the treble. We start to elevate in the super, super uppy treble, the airy regions, and then we have good extension past that. Now, I'm going to put the K361 on here. The K361 definitely has more sub-bass presence. If you are a big bass head, you'll probably like the K361 more. But the FT1 I found to just be a little bit more punchy, a little bit more engaging, and I liked the extra warmth you get right here in the low mid-range. Beyond that, the K361 recesses a little bit more in the 300 to 400 kilohertz region compared to the FiiO, just a little bit. And it's not as much because of that region dips as it is because the region after that, between say 600 hertz and 1.2 kilohertz, is a little bit more elevated on the K361 than it is on the FiiO FT-1. They start to kind of join and overlap again up until about 2.5K, where the FiiO FT-1 dips in more than the K361 does, and then they trade places a little bit, and the K361 starts to dip in. As we go more into the upper treble, they're kind of similar in that 6K region, but it's higher on the FiiO FT-1, and then the treble above that, all the way up until about 12 kilohertz, is notably higher on the K361 than it is on the FiiO FT-1. I find the FT-1 to sound better and more tame in the treble than the K361. It doesn't have the same super ultra mega thumpy bass, but the bass is still so deep that I just don't care. It's plenty of bass for me, and I tend to prefer K361 bass over K371 bass anyway. And this is straight up smoother in the treble than the K361 or K371 are. I also just want to show how comparable this is in terms of frequency response to something like the Focal Azuris, which I have now here in blue, measured on the exact same rig at that. Both of these are good headphones. The Focal is definitely built better, but I prefer the sound of the FT-1. And I also prefer the comfort of the FT-1, especially with the strap added on top. Also, you can technically swap the pads on these if you're having trouble with your seal. This is another set of pads. They are the Deconi T50 leather pads. Very similar performance through most of the frequency response, though you do get less bass. It's still very linear bass, but you get less bass. These I got a little bit better of a seal on, but I just prefer the bass of the stock pads. So, conclusion time. The FiiO FT-1 is excellent. It's a headphone that really surprised me. It's not perfect, but with some small modifications like this, it goes a really long way. This is a rare newcomer headphone that I think has the potential to be a long-term stayer if people recognize how good it is. I hope that we see this headphone around for a long time because it's excellent and it deserves it. I'm going to have this headphone linked in the video description. We don't actually sell this headphone on headphones.com, but if you want something we do sell, we have these sweet Listen More cables that are compatible with it in both single-ended and in balanced. So that's going to wrap this up. If you like this video, leave a like down below. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think about these and let me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, you can at the forum or Discord, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Till next one, guys. Peace.